Obrigado. Vou falar em inglês. Eu falo pouco português, mas não muito. É mais fácil para mim falar em inglês. Desculpa. Também tenho uma conexão pessoal com Portugal porque minha esposa é portuguesa. É por causa disso que eu falo.
Muito bem.
Tem que ser. So thank you also, as Professor Diaz said, for the organization of this event and the opportunity to present today. I'm grateful to all of the organizers. So I'm going to speak today about, Professor Diaz spoke about the founding of the Canadian Dominicans that came from France. I'm going to speak about, in fact, the first friars who came to Canada, who were not from France. They were from the St. Joseph province in the United States. So this is a history that is not well known. We know, of course, well the history of the founding of the order that continues today that came from France. But very little is known about this brief period of time when the first friars came in more than a decade before the founding of the French province in Canada. So that's what I'm going to speak about. And at the end, to speculate what could have been in terms of the influences, if they had stayed, on Portugal. So, just so you know where I'm going. Vou falar por a volta de 20 minutos, 25 minutos. Tá bem? History has recorded well that the Order of Preachers first arrived in Canada from the France province in 1873. They established themselves in St. Hyacinthe, Quebec. From there began their ministry of preaching. In 1885, the community opened a novitiate in St. Hyacinthe, which was later relocated 250 kilometers away. In 1909, they opened a studium. 2 years later, in 1911, the Canadian province of St. Dominic was founded as an autonomous province separate from France. From there, as Professor Diaz said, the community expanded into the United States and went into other places in the world, and in 1948 was involved in the restoration of the Portuguese province of the order, which had been suppressed for more than a century. So this overview is in brief the well-known history of the first Dominican friars in Canada. However, it would be more accurate to say that this is not the history of the first Dominican friars in Canada, but the beginning of the establishment of the Canadian Dominican province, which continues today. The history of the first friars in Canada is in fact somewhat different, quite unknown by many, and goes back to 1861, 12 years before the arrival of the community from France. And it begins in the Diocese of London, Ontario, which is in the Anglophone area of Canada, some 800 kilometers southwest of St. Hyacinthe, where the French community came. So the purpose of my paper is to detail the arrival of these brothers, where they came from, what was the reason for their arrival, something of the ministry while they were there in Canada, and to explain the unusual and unfortunate circumstances surrounding their departure from the country only 7 years later, and still 5 years before the brothers from France would arrive. So the Diocese of London, where the friars first arrived, was created in 1856. So everyone knows Canada is a young country. At that time, the region of London was still very much a developing frontier region with very few people in it. Although it was the result of the dividing up of the older Diocese of Quebec, the first diocese, over many decades into smaller, more manageable territories. It was still more than 21,000 square kilometers, so about 25% the size of Portugal. So it was still a very large diocese. There were 30,000 Catholics throughout the region, of which 30,000 Catholics throughout the region, which represented 13% of the population, so Catholics were the minority. Most of them were part of the oldest Catholic communities that sprang from a French mission called Our Lady of the Assumption 100 years before that, and grew in and around the town of Sandwich. In Windsor, if you know Detroit, it's in that area. The second largest group of Catholics were in and around the area of London, several hundred kilometers away, which was chosen as the see of the diocese. They were newer to the area, arriving as immigrants in the first half of the 19th century, and they were mostly Irish. These two groups, the French Canadians, the older group, and the English-speaking Irish, are considered to be the founding groups, cultural groups of the London diocese. The newly created diocese had its own set of challenges. There were not enough priests to serve the parishes and mission communities. There was a lack of schools and hospitals, and the new immigrants were poor and uneducated. These were only some of the problems. When the bishops of Canada petitioned Pope Pius IX in 1854 for the creation of the diocese, they spoke about the power of the Protestants in the region and the need for more worship, discipline, and temperance in drinking. The first Bishop of London was Adolphe Pinsonneau. He was installed on the 29th of June, 1856. He came from a large, wealthy family in Quebec, just outside of Montreal. Although Pinsonneau was fully French, of French language, and from Francophone Canada, he was also fully bilingual. He communicated very well in English. For 6 years, he was the vicar of St. Patrick's Church in Montreal, an English language parish. In 1850, he went to the Anglophone Diocese of Toronto to assist the Bishop de Charbonnel in organizing his diocesan offices. It would be the Bishop of Toronto, Charbonnel, who would suggest Pinsonneau to Rome as the choice for bishop of the newly created London. And Bishop Bourget, who Professor Diaz mentioned, supported this recommendation. From a theoretical standpoint, Pinsonneau obviously had much to offer the diocese. He was very well educated, cultured, fluent in both French and English, loyal to the hierarchy of the church, and had shown himself to be a skilled administrator, first as vicar of St. Patrick's, and then canon of Montreal, and then as an assistant to the Bishop of Toronto. These should have been useful qualities to help him in overseeing and organizing the development of a new frontier diocese with both French and English-speaking Catholics. However, as the historical record has shown, it's hard to imagine a worse choice. His education and privilege made him haughty, pretentious, impatient, quick-tempered, and autocratic. As one person described it, Bishop Pinsonneau was fitted by traditional environment, temperament, and training to reign over an old, well-established French diocese in the grand manner of a French seigneur of the old school. The London diocese, however, was far from this. The Catholics were, in large part, unrefined and uneducated. While in the diocese, Pinsonneau would make several important decisions during his short episcopacy. But perhaps the most significant decision that he would make during his time in London was to move the see of the diocese from the city of London, or the town of London at the time, to Sandwich, which was another town 200 kilometers away on the very edge of the diocese. And he did so shortly after his arrival. And it was this decision, that is to move the see of the diocese, that would directly result in the first Dominicans coming into Canada. He explained in his rationale for moving the diocese that there were not enough Catholics in London to justify having the cathedral there. He'd been told repeatedly that there were 4,000 Catholics in London. However, he said the number did not even average 2,000. The cost of maintaining the residence, therefore, was too great for the size of the congregation. The parish was already in debt. The cost of maintaining the cathedral in London only made the debt worse. Pastorally, the parish, he said, in fact needed no more than one priest. He convinced the Archbishop of Quebec, Charles-François Baillargeon, to endorse the petition and to send it to Alessandro Barnabo, the newly appointed prefect of the Roman congregation Propaganda Fide. Pinsonneau decided then to travel to Rome in the fall of 1858 to plead his case with Barnabo, with the hope of securing success, permission to move the see of the diocese. It would seem that he was successful in his petition. He spoke to Barnabo and to Pope Pius IX, and secured permission to transfer the seat of the diocese from London to Sandwich. Apparently, though, there was a condition, and this is an important condition. He was required to have a religious order take his place at the cathedral where he had been, because he was moving the cathedral, so that he was required to have a religious community come in and take over that what was the cathedral. It would now be St. Peter's Church. Therefore, while he was in Rome, he also met with Father Jandel, master of the Order of Preachers. Given the large number of Irish in London, Jandel encouraged Pinsonneau to write to Father White, who was the provincial of the Dominicans in Dublin. Pinsonneau did so from the Piazza Farnese on the 20th of February, 1859. So this is about 5 months after he arrived in Rome. He asked White to send 2 or 3 priests to London to take over St. Peter's Church. He said a very substantial brick church and a presbytery was quite new. There were about 2 acres of ground in the very heart of the town. The responsibility, he said, of the friars would be to oversee the congregation and to preach retreats throughout the diocese. All of their traveling expenses would be paid. Pinsonneau noted that there were only about 2,000 Catholics in London, among a population then of about 10,000, mostly Protestants. But the friars would still be quite busy throughout the diocese with retreats, because there were about 50,000 Catholics by then throughout the diocese. He then added that most of the people in London are Irish, presumably in an attempt to persuade the provincial to agree to send Dominicans. In the closing of his letter, he emphasized that the Father General, the Cardinal Prefect of Propaganda, and the Holy Father himself were very desirous that the foundation be made as soon as possible. He presumed that everything would fall into place, that the Irish Dominicans would agree to come, and he returned to London in the spring, and the see of the diocese was officially moved. The Dominicans of Ireland, though, did not arrive. Bishop Pinsonneau received a reply indicating that they would come as soon as they had the time to prepare some of the friars and train them properly to work within Canada. On October the 5th, 1860, almost 20 months after writing to him for the first time in Rome, Pinsonneau wrote to Father White again. This time he sounded alarmed. He had expected the Dominicans to have arrived already and said that Barnabo was surprised to learn that the community had not yet taken over St. Peter's. He asked the Irish provincial to do him the favor of writing either directly to the Cardinal Prefect himself to explain the reasons for the delay, or to do so through Father Jandel. He closed by assuring the provincial that the Irish province would not regret the decision to establish the order in Upper Canada. He also promised that the superior of the community would become Vicar General of that part of the diocese. Pinsonneau, though, was under a lot of pressure. He'd already moved the see of the diocese to Sandwich, and he'd made assurances to those in Rome that he would have a religious order take over St. Peter's in London. He'd asked the Irish Dominicans, but they were not yet there. This is 2 years later. By the following June, he, in an act of apparent desperation, had his Vicar General, Father Jean-Marie Brière, write to Father Isaac Hecker, the founder of the newly formed American Missionary Society of St. Paul the Apostle, or the Paulist Fathers, inviting them to take over London. The same promises were made: the church, the land, the people. This time, though, instead of citing the actual number of Catholics in London, the letter only said that there was a large and respectable Catholic population. No mention of them was made of them being Irish. As a further attempt to secure someone, Pinsonneau then wrote to the Benedictines of St. Vincent's Abbey in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. So now he invited 3 religious communities. The Benedictines came, but only later, and they took over one of the colleges in the diocese. The Paulist Fathers didn't come, but the Dominicans did, not from the Irish province, but from the St. Joseph province in the United States. They came from St. Rose Priory in Springfield, Kentucky, some 850 kilometers away. It was through Father Brière, Pinsonneau's Vicar General, that the friars arrived in the diocese. Brière had worked in Kentucky. He went there in 1840 to teach theology at St. Joseph's College, and later became rector of the cathedral at Louisville. It was there that he came to know the Dominicans of St. Rose Priory, which was only 30 kilometers away. He would invite the St. Joseph Province Dominicans to St. Peter's in London in the fall of 1861. The deal was signed in September of 1861 between the provincial of the St. Joseph Province, Father Joseph Kelly, and Bishop Pinsonneau. In it, Pinsonneau agreed to lease the whole of the church property to London to the Dominicans for a term of 99 years or more, if it can be legally done. The Dominicans agreed to assume the church's debt of $4,280. Father Kelly wrote to Jandel to tell him the news of the order, the order was going to Canada, to the London diocese, expecting Jandel to be pleased. For some time, Jandel had been encouraging the St. Joseph province to make new foundings. Kelly said that there was no expense to relocate, the facilities were excellent, and an income was already beginning to come in. 3 of the friars were already there. In the letter of agreement written by Pinsonneau in October, he further indicated that the Dominicans had 15 years to pay off the church's debt. And he said, if the church in London ever got big enough, the right to divide the single parish that was there remained that of the bishop. But the Dominicans would have the first right to choose whether or not they would take over the parishes that grew out of this one parish. In other words, it could have been possible for the American Dominicans to have established themselves very well and spread throughout the then expanding Anglophone area of Upper Canada. Jandel, though, was not happy. There's no suggestion that he was unhappy with the move to London itself. He was only unhappy that Father Kelly had not asked his permission in advance and that he'd signed a contract without the consent of the general. Nevertheless, the friars were now in London. They were to be there for at least 99 years, and they were Americans, not Irish. The 3 Dominicans who formed the first community of friars in Canada were Father O'Brien, who became the prior, Father Roquefort, and Father Ralph. The early community, though, got off to a difficult start with Bishop Pinsonneau, who exercised his authority comfortably and was likely quite rule-oriented. As early as December of 1861, so this is 3 months later, the bishop had cause to write to Father O'Brien about the laxity of his 2 other confreres. Apparently, there were reports from the clergy and the laity of London that the young friars were not following the sort of lifestyle that Pinsonneau expected. He expected them to live, quote, a life of meditation, of study, and of ascetic retirement from the world, end of quote. They, however, were doing anything but. They had acquired a reputation of being, quote, jolly companions, habitually without their holy habit, end of quote. Instead of references to them following the rules of the monastic order or to their meditation, study, or other, quote unquote, pious exercises, the bishop had heard of them out mostly every evening, singing, eating, drinking, playing cards, and amusing themselves with the young people, as would any other ordinary man. Reportedly, it was quite common for them to return home, quote, from these dangerous visits, end of quote, as late as 11 o'clock. Pinsonneau made it clear to O'Brien that he expected the friars to preach as much by their holy life as by their word of mouth. They were not to go out without the prior's permission, and when they did, it was only for official duties or for recreation. They were never to go out for, quote unquote, worldly amusement. And they were never, quote, to take tea or drink wine or liquors. They were to refuse invitations to evening parties and avoid familiar conversation with women. Pinsonneau closed his letter by encouraging O'Brien to deal with the situation immediately, but warned, quote, I am determined, if need be, to have recourse to a higher authority than your own, end of quote, if the situation is not corrected. It's not clear how Father O'Brien dealt with the situation. However, the concerns were never raised again in writing by the bishop. According to reports, the presence of the Dominicans in London was a great success. In an interview with one of the members of the community, Father Durkin, sometime in the 20th century, he described in part the success of their pastoral outreach. For example, he said Father O'Brien would often walk the back roads around London ministering to the farmers. He would stop various Catholic farmers, determine the last time of their confession, and if it had been a long time, as it usually was, he would hear the confession right there, and oftentimes through the wheel of the wagon. But there were at least two other ways that one might measure the success of these early friars. First, they convinced the parishioners of St. Peter's, the church that they'd taken over, to donate money to improve the church building. Through their donations, side galleries were constructed next to the nave to accommodate the overflow of people on Sunday. A steeple was added to the church, that made the church more visible at a distance, and a bell tower was built. Second, and more importantly for the order, there were vocations. According to one source, there were 8 young men from London who took the habit through the influence of these first friars. According to another source, they received 16 to 18 vocations. In either case, the number is impressive. The number is all the more impressive if we consider that the community only stayed in the London diocese for 7 years before returning to the United States in 1868. The sequence of events that led to their departure is interesting. In short, they were victims of circumstance. In December 1866, Bishop Pinsonneau announced his resignation as ordinary of the diocese, bishop of the diocese. Officially, the reasons were his declining health, increased deafness, and the need for a younger man to take on the challenges of a then growing diocese. Unofficially, though, he'd had a number of negative encounters with the priests and people in a few short years of his episcopacy, but there was one encounter in particular that caused him to lose the support of some of his fellow bishops, priests, and laity. So he resigned. This event had a direct influence on the departure of the friars. Bishop Pinsonneau's replacement was Bishop John Walsh, an affable and social person who had a universal interest in people and a genuine charm. Even before his consecration in October 1867, he informed the then Dominican provincial of the St. Joseph province, William O'Carroll, that the 99-year lease he was invalidating the 99-year lease agreement, breaking the contract, and he was returning the see of the diocese from Sandwich back to St. Peter's in London. So 7 years later, they were moving the cathedral that 200 kilometers again. He explained that Sandwich was too far on the edge of the diocese and it needed to be returned to London. Ironically, it was Father Kelly who had received the news that they had to leave. He was the provincial who had arranged for the friars to come to Canada in 1861 and was now the prior in London. The community left in January of 1868. Bishop Walsh offered them another church in the diocese. However, they declined. The American province was short on friars, and O'Carroll wanted to concentrate their missions in the eastern and central part of the United States. So, to conclude, as I mentioned, the departure of the St. Joseph Dominicans from London was the result of a series of unfortunate circumstances in the settling of a young, pioneering diocese in southwestern Canada. Pinsonneau was only in his early 50s in 1868. If he had stayed until his natural retirement, the see would perhaps have remained in Sandwich, at least for another decade or so, before a successor may have moved it. The parish of London would have grown, other parishes would have been created, and the order of preachers might have been firmly rooted in the region. The work of the community was clearly successful, given the number of vocations that were attracted in only 7 years. As Anglophone Upper Canada and the Catholic population of the dioceses north, east of London grew in the latter part of the 19th and 20th centuries, Hamilton, Kingston, and especially the populous diocese of Toronto, the likelihood of this missionary community expanding would have been very good, even to the point of possibly forming a separate and distinct province of the order. In this case, the province would have expanded up to the territorial border of the French-Canadian province of Dominicans in Quebec that arrived in Canada in 1873 and grew from there. These two provinces, one francophone, the other anglophone, may perhaps have operated as two solitudes, separated by linguistic and cultural differences, each remaining in their own regions. Or there may have been fruitful cooperation and collaboration, and perhaps the community that settled in London would have been involved in assisting Portugal in 1948. In this case, it is fair to ask, how would this have affected Portugal? How different would the influences that Professor Diaz spoke about, that he mentioned, how different would those influences have been? All of this, though, of course, is speculative. The fact is that the early community that so greatly shaped the area around London between 1861 and 1868 left. Although their legacy has faded over the generations, the last of their vocations dying in 1950, a remnant of their presence remains. But for many people in London, it remains a mystery. In the region to the west of St. Peter's Cathedral Basilica in London, just outside of the heart of the city, there are vestiges of these early friars. There is there a well-known bridge. Once that was used for vehicular traffic, it's now for pedestrian traffic, and it's called Blackfriars Bridge. There are also some businesses that have included in that area the word Blackfriar in their names, restaurants, salons, and so on. No doubt the businesses are reflecting the heritage of the area that was once traveled by the friars, unaware of the reason why the word Blackfriar even appears. Nevertheless, their presence does stand as a reminder of the community that was once there, both as a testament to the past and perhaps a beckoning for their future return. Obrigado.